Story 1. I love to run. It's the only time I get to myself each day. You see, I'm a financial analyst and work at a big bank in the city. By the time I get home, the day is almost over. Thus, the only free time I have to run is at night. I was never a morning person, too groggy to do anything before work, so morning jogs were out of the question. It was a typical fall day. The October air was brisk. Halloween was on Monday, and I was ready for October to be over. Work was crazy that month. We signed a huge client and our bill was based solely on the success of our investment recommendations. I knew we would make a killing. The market was hot and we got in at the exact right time. Nonetheless, the client was very demanding. If they wanted something done, it had to be completed immediately. No ifs, ands, or buts. This caused many late nights, a diet to rival that of a college freshman, and consumption of copious amounts of coffee. My boss was a guy by the name of Mike. The first thing that came to mind when I thought of Mike was brilliant. Guy was a true investing wizard. However, Mike was always very serious and seemed like he had a lot on his mind. At the time, I thought nothing of it. With long hours, it's tough to maintain a social life. He probably just needed a vacation. Anyway, I went to work that day like any other day. It looked like my daily tasks were almost finished, and I'd be able to get out of the dungeon by 7 or 8 p.m. Hell, I planned to get one of my relaxing runs in when the sun was still out. But, to my dismay, Mike placed yet another set of financial statements onto my desk. These must have been over 200 pages. It was the information on yet another potential acquisition our client wanted to make. Mike said I needed to summarize all the important stuff. As he would always say, he wanted the meat of the document compressed into 4 easy-to-read pages by tomorrow morning. I swear I could have cried at that moment, but I sacked up and got to reading. Thank God I learned how to speed read. Fast forward 4 hours, a cup of coffee, and 4 slices of pizza later, and my summary was ready for Mike. I opened my email account, attached the document, clicked send, boom. It would always frustrate me that Mike would request things with such a short turnaround time. You see, he always left earlier than everyone else. I mean, the dude had been at the firm for 10 years. It was clear he had paid his dues. But it would have been nice to receive a thank you email once in a while after my late nights. Whatever, I muttered to myself as I turned off my laptop and hit the road. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I left the office. I rushed home and sat on my couch. I really didn't feel like jogging that night. I was very tired. I had no desire to do anything besides browse Reddit, watch Netflix, and eat the carton of ice cream that was in my fridge. Ambition prevailed, and I laced up and was stretching in front of my house by 12:15. The night was foggy, brisk but not too cold. It was the perfect weather for a beautiful night run. The moon shined bright and full, giving the night a slightly ominous feeling. One of the frats at the community college around the block was having a Halloween party, so I saw some guys dressed up as Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, and Jason Voorhees double-fisting Coors Lights walk past my house when I was stretching. Talk about scenery. I was ready to go. I had my playlist blasting and my new iRunner app opened to track my distance. Since it was so late and that pizza was on its way out, I decided to run the short 4-mile loop around the neighborhood. I would run all the way to this abandoned house and then loop around the neighborhood back to home sweet home. I was off to the races. Normally, when I jog, I clear my head and achieve a zen-like state, but that night had been different. All things considered, it was the perfect weather for a run, but something just felt a little bit off, as if someone was watching me at certain points of my run. Being exhausted after a long day of work, I brushed it off at the time. After about 1.5 miles and the third replay of Blue Oyster Cult's Don't Fear the Reaper on my iPhone, I noticed a bat flying around the tree in front of me. I know bats shouldn't be something I'm so nonchalant about, but in my area they're not all that uncommon. However, this bat flew past me, turned around, and then suddenly flew directly at me. I ducked, avoiding it by no more than an inch. I was shocked, as bats normally fly away from humans. I stopped for a minute, watched the bat fly along at seemingly airplane speed. It was as if it was flying away from something. I shrugged and continued on my way. I was a little freaked out, but it was nothing too notable. After a few more minutes, I reached the abandoned house. The gutter above the entryway was collapsed onto the awning, as always. The top left window was shattered, as always, and the broken down Mercedes was in the driveway, as always. As per my routine, I took a breather at the house and stretched out a little. As I was doing lunges in front of the driveway, I noticed a large figure walking down the block. The figure was very large and must have stood at around 6 foot 5 inches tall. It was also very muscular and appeared to be entirely covered in some sort of hair. I know what you're thinking, what the hell? But as I mentioned, the local college was having a Halloween party down the block, and I had just seen the holy trinity of horror characters less than an hour ago, so I assumed someone had dressed up as some sort of wolf and was on his way back to the party. Sure, he was large, but it was no big deal. He was all the way down the block, and I had to finish this run and get to bed. I had to be at work by 8 a.m. for yet another client meeting. I finished catching my breath and started running home. The second half of my runs were my favorite part. You really get into that zone. Nonetheless, that weird feeling of being watched was still present. I was at the last mile mark, as denoted by the old mansion on the corner of Pat Lane and Old Maple Road. Almost home free, I thought to myself. I was blasting some old school rock and roll when I felt a thumping. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. Then I realized it was becoming more and more evident every step I took. I stopped, I looked around, and I saw nothing. Just me, the full moon, and the street ahead. I shook my head and kept running. After another minute or so, the thumping started again. This time I ignored it and approached the walkway to my house. The run was over. I felt relief. I stood in front of my lawn and looked up at the old elm tree on my neighbor's lawn. The tree was so strong and beautiful. The branches looked like they'd hung there for over a century. Then I noticed something. 2 yellow eyes appeared about 7 feet above one of the branches. Gooseflesh immediately developed up and down my entire body. I shook my head, thinking it was just a result of my runner's high, but the eyes remained. All of a sudden, the branch completely collapsed. In front of me stood an animal of some sort. It looked like a wolf, but it stood upright at a height of what had to be 7 feet. It was clear that the animal did not intend to fall, as the large branch simply broke out from underneath it. It scraped its forearm on the fall, causing a long gash from its wrist to its elbow. I could see its brown fur become darker with blood. Suddenly, it let out one long howling sound. I was in total shock as I stared dumbfounded at the animal. It began approaching me, slowly but firmly. It was clear that it was the predator and I was the prey. I came to my senses and began sprinting to my front door. The animal initiated pursuit and began to close in on me. Luckily, I had left my front door unlocked that evening. I opened the door, slipped behind it, and locked it immediately. I ran to the nearest closet and pulled out my father's old rifle. After taking a deep breath, I loaded it. I have a large group of windows on the first floor of my house that overlooked the front yard. I peered through these windows, cursing the day I put windows in such a vulnerable area. I saw nothing, just the bright, full moon shining. I looked for a few minutes, sure that the animal was still lurking on my lawn. After 10 minutes of searching, I shut the shades and sat down on my couch. I know, I should have called for help. I was too busy trying to determine if this was all actually happening or simply a product of my imagination. After a few more minutes of internal debate, I heard a weird sound coming from the front door. I got up, grabbed the rifle from the table in front of me, and approached my window. I peered out from the far side of the shade and saw the animal, what now clearly resembled a wolf, scratching at my front door as if it was a trick-or-treater in search of candy. Its fur had turned a coppery color. Its large paws had 3-inch nails on the tips of what appeared to be elongated wide fingers. Its eyeballs were yellow and surrounded small black pupils. After a few seconds of intense observation, the wolf noticed me and began to approach the window. I stood back, aimed my rifle, and replaced the shade over the window. The wolf simply stood there, no movement whatsoever. This went on for minutes. Its shadow was large, intimidating, and oddly still. Some odd instinct caused me to open the shade. I didn't want to open it, but something inside me, perhaps man's natural sense of curiosity, forced me to do it. I pulled the long metal cord and the shade opened. The wolf stood there. It stared at me, stared into me, stared through me. I was so frightened, but I couldn't stop staring into its eyes. It was addictive, almost hypnotic. The wolf began licking the window. Its tongue was blood red and over a foot long. Its mouth opened as wide as that of a great white shark about to claim an innocent seal. Its teeth were long and razor sharp. They were as yellow as pages in an old manuscript that had been rotting in a library for centuries. Overcome with panic, I fainted and fell onto my living room floor. I woke up the next day to the alarm clock in my bedroom upstairs. I hoped last night was a dream. These hopes were crushed when I realized the rifle was still out and my running shoes were still on my feet. I looked towards the window. The shade was still opened, and there was a large wet spot about 2 feet long. The saliva bubbles were still there. I checked outside the window and saw no one. I slowly and carefully opened my front door. Looking back, I probably should have been even more careful. But, for some reason, the sun made me feel completely safe. There were deep, long scratches in the wooden door, deep enough to require the purchase of a new door, but not deep enough to completely pierce through the expensive oak. That day at work, I was exhausted. I walked in about an hour late. I just made it to the client meeting. Before we walked in, Mike grabbed me and thanked me for the summary. He said it was great and that he read it on the train ride this morning. We sat down with the client. After a few minutes of intense discussion, Mike rolled up the sleeves of his purple dress shirt. I immediately noticed a cut. The cut was deep and started at his wrists and ran down to the area near his elbow. I never complained about Mike not staying late at work after that October night. In fact, I left the firm as soon as I could. I also started to run in the morning. It's amazing what a pre-run coffee can do for your laziness. I'm still not sure if what happened that night was a coincidental dream or just my first and hopefully last encounter with something from another world. Now that I think about it, I vaguely remember Mike's eyeballs being slightly yellow in that morning meeting. Maybe he was anemic, or maybe, you know what I'm getting at.